August 1945. The war was ending in explosions and broadcasts, but deep in the back roads of Luzon, Burma, and occupied China, silence reigned inside the so-called comfort stations. In one bamboo-framed hut, the air smelled of mildew, sweat, and lamp oil. Young women sat on reed mats, their eyes hollow, their bodies marked by exhaustion and fear. They had been abandoned days earlier when Japanese soldiers fled into the jungle. But freedom had not arrived with that departure. For the women, absence felt as dangerous as presence. They whispered to each other in Korean, Tagalog, Mandarin, their voices barely above the hum of cicadas. None spoke of hope. Hope was a dangerous luxury. One girl, only 16, traced her finger across the floorboards, as though carving an invisible escape route. Another clutched a cloth scrap torn from her old school uniform, the last piece of her past life. Rumors seeped through like smoke. The Americans were near. But this news brought no comfort. They had been told that Americans were worse than demons, that any new soldiers meant new torment. The youngest asked the oldest what to do if the Americans came. The older woman, 23, shook her head. "Survive," she whispered. "Just survive." That night they heard distant engines growling through the jungle. Not the sharp boots of Japanese patrols, but a heavier, unfamiliar rhythm. The women clutched each other, trembling. The cicadas went quiet. Even the night air seemed to wait. A dog barked somewhere outside, then silenced with a whimper. The women prepared themselves for what they thought was inevitable. They pulled their thin garments tight, lowered their heads, and braced their bodies for the cycle. They knew too well. The door rattled. A wooden latch snapped open. Silhouettes filled the frame. Broad shoulders, helmets, rifles slung at their sides. The women gasped, shrinking back into the corners. But something was different. The figures didn't bark orders in Japanese. They didn't rush forward. Instead, they lowered their weapons. Their hands were open. Their voices, though foreign, carried no threat. One soldier bent down and set a wooden crate on the floor. Another followed, laying down a box with careful slowness, as if approaching frightened birds. The women froze. Crates could mean anything, supplies or tricks, salvation or doom. But when the lid cracked open, the glint of canned food shimmered in the lantern light. The women stared at the shining tins inside the crates. Labels they could not read glowed faintly under the lantern's flame. The soldiers did not reach for the women. They simply pushed the boxes closer, then stepped back. The silence in the hut thickened. The women exchanged fearful glances. This was not how it worked. Soldiers took. They never offered. Suspicion curled tighter than hunger. One of the Americans reached into his pack again. This time he pulled out something small, wrapped in wax paper. He held it out, palm open. Chocolate. A sweet no one here had tasted before. The youngest of the women covered her mouth, shaking her head. She'd been forced to take gifts before. Every gift came with a price. Her body knew better than her mind. Nothing was free. The soldiers seemed to sense their hesitation. They exchanged uneasy looks, whispering to each other in English. One of them muttered something that sounded almost like frustration, almost like pity. Then came the gesture. The red-haired GI, awkward but determined, unwrapped a piece of the chocolate, popped it into his own mouth, and chewed. He exaggerated the act like a clown in a village square. The absurdity broke the tension for a heartbeat. One woman let out a startled laugh, half hysterical, half relieved. She clamped her hands over her mouth, ashamed. But the soldier only smiled. Slowly, painfully, curiosity began to seep through the cracks of terror. An older Filipino woman stretched her hand out, fingers trembling, and touched one of the tins. The GI gently slid it toward her. She clutched it to her chest like contraband. It was absurd. A tin of peaches treated like treasure. But in her hollow eyes, it was more than food. It was the first proof that these men might not demand her body. Still, fear did not vanish. The women sat rigid, waiting for the deception to reveal itself. Perhaps the kindness was only a trick, the calm before the familiar storm. But then another soldier, younger, pulled from his pack a small bottle. Water. Clear, clean, sloshing inside glass. He knelt, placed it on the ground, and slid it across the floor like an offering at a shrine. The Korean girl, the one who still whispered her mother's lullabies at night, reached out before she could stop herself. Her fingers brushed the cool glass. She lifted it to her lips. The first swallow was sharp, cutting through the dryness of her throat. She closed her eyes, clutching the bottle, as if it were her own heartbeat. And in that moment, disbelief washed over her. The Americans did not step forward. They did not jeer. They only waited, silent, as though understanding that trust could not be taken. It had to be given. The air inside the hut was thick, heavy with suspicion. The women still huddled close, eyes darting between the crates of food and the strangers in dusty uniforms. Fear was a habit that would not loosen easily. The Americans, sensing their hesitation, exchanged looks again. One reached into his jacket and pulled out something unexpected, a small harmonica. The women tensed, not knowing what it was. Then, to everyone's surprise, he lifted it to his lips and began to play. The sound was clumsy, the notes uneven, but it wasn't sharp commands or the bark of officers. It was music. The melody floated through the dim hut, soft and almost playful. For a moment, even the cicadas outside seemed to fall silent, as though the jungle itself paused to listen. The women blinked, startled. Music was not part of their captivity. Music meant choice, freedom, beauty. To hear it now from a soldier's breath felt like a dream folded into reality. One of the younger girls stifled a laugh, her shoulders shaking. The harmonica player exaggerated his tune, rolling his eyes when he missed a note, drawing quiet chuckles from his comrades. The women stared, stunned. Soldiers were not supposed to laugh at themselves. Soldiers were not supposed to look foolish on purpose. This small absurdity cracked something in the air. Tentatively, one woman, older, her hair streaked with dust, allowed herself to smile. It was faint, fleeting, but it was real. And the soldiers noticed. Encouraged, another GI rummaged through his pack and pulled out a wooden carving. A bird, its wings spread, rough but recognizable. He set it gently on the floor and slid it toward the women. No one moved at first. Then the youngest girl crept forward on her knees, scooping up the little bird. She cradled it in her hands as if holding proof that gentleness could exist in the world again. The others watched, their fear fraying thread by thread. Soldiers who carved birds and played music could not be the same men who once marched them into cages of silence. The women were still wary, still guarded, but the wall of terror, so carefully built through years of brutality, began to show its first cracks. The Americans did not press. They simply remained, waiting, offering smiles, handing over soap, food, and bandages without asking for anything in return. And for the first time, a fragile thought began to take root among the captives. Maybe these uniforms did not mean pain. Maybe they meant something else. The hut remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer suffocating with dread. It was charged with questions. The women's eyes, still cautious, began to study the soldiers not as predators, but as puzzles. One soldier, noticing their thirst, unscrewed a canteen and poured water into a metal cup. He placed it gently on the floor, sliding it forward without a word, then stepped back. The women stared. A younger prisoner, no older than 16, reached for it with trembling fingers. She braced for the slap, the barked order she had come to expect. But none came. The cup remained hers. She lifted it to her lips. Cool water flowed down her throat, washing away not just the taste of hunger, but a fragment of disbelief. She lowered the cup, eyes wide, and for the first time dared to meet the soldier's gaze. His expression was tired, sunburned, but soft. He gave a single nod as though to say, "Drink more." That silent exchange carried more weight than any command. Around her, the others watched. A second woman reached forward, this time for the tin of peaches still resting on the floor. Her hands shook as she peeled it open, with the soldier's help. The syrupy scent filled the hut, sweet and alien. She dipped her fingers in, bringing the sticky fruit to her lips. The taste hit her like a storm, sweetness so intense she wept as she chewed. Tears streamed down her face, not from pain this time, but from shock. For years she had known only bitterness. Now, for a fleeting moment, there was sweetness. The other women leaned forward, no longer frozen statues, but cautious participants. One touched the bar of soap, sniffed it, pressed it against her cheek. Another fingered the wooden bird carving as though it might fly away. The soldiers said little, but their silence was deliberate. No commands, no demands. Just presence. They knew that trust could not be forced. It had to be offered. One GI crouched low, resting on his heels so his eyes were level with theirs. He placed his rifle aside, the gesture so radical that the women gasped. A soldier without his weapon was no longer just a soldier. He was a man. For the first time, the women whispered among themselves. The language barrier shielded their words, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer pure fear. It was hesitation, shading into wonder. The red-haired soldier lifted his harmonica again, this time playing softer, slower. The notes carried not just sound, but reassurance. And in the half-light of the hut, one woman allowed herself to laugh, quiet, uncertain, but unmistakably human. The laughter, thin, fragile, almost accidental, lingered in the air. For the women, it felt forbidden, a sound they thought war had stolen forever. Yet here it was, escaping like sunlight through cracks in bamboo. The Americans froze at first, startled by the sound, then smiled, genuine, relieved. One of them, the youngest GI, chuckled softly and shook his head, as though reassuring her it was safe to laugh. The tension shifted. Shoulders that had been rigid for years began to loosen. The women's breaths came slower, deeper, no longer as shallow as prey animals awaiting the strike. One soldier, careful and deliberate, reached into his pack and drew out a small packet of crackers. He broke one in half and set the pieces on the floor, sliding them forward. This time, two women reached at once. They paused, uncertain, then shared the crumbs between them. It was the first act of choice they had been allowed in years, not commanded, not forced, simply offered. The smallest freedom felt immense. A medic entered next, his hands steady, his uniform marked with a red cross. He carried bandages and iodine. The women recoiled, memories of inspections burning in their minds. But the medic knelt low, his voice calm. He gestured gently to an open wound on one woman's arm, waiting for her to agree. She hesitated, heart hammering, then gave the faintest nod. He cleaned the cut, applied the bandage, and stepped back without another word, her eyes filled with tears. Not because of pain, but because it was the first time in years a man had touched her body without taking something from it. Healing, not harm. Care, not conquest. Others began to inch forward, showing bruises, burns, and sores. Each was treated with the same quiet respect. The room that once reeked of sweat and fear now carried the antiseptic scent of iodine and something rarer, trust. One woman whispered to another in Korean, "Could this be real?" Her friend only shook her head, unable to answer. Reality had always been cruelty. This gentleness felt like fiction. The Americans exhausted themselves, sat cross-legged on the floor. They passed cigarettes between each other, careful not to offer them unless asked. They leaned back against the walls like men resting, not conquerors staking territory. The Korean girl who had clutched the bird carving earlier now held it close to her chest. For the first time, she did not clutch it from fear of theft, but from gratitude that it had been given freely. In the strange quiet of that hut, both sides found themselves breathing differently. The women no longer flinched at every movement, and the soldiers no longer looked like strangers in enemy uniforms. Morning came slowly, light spilling through the gaps in the bamboo walls. For the women, dawn had always meant fear, the arrival of guards, inspections, endless orders. But this dawn was different. Instead of Japanese commands, they heard the low murmur of English outside, broken by laughter. The sound was strange, too casual to be threatening, too relaxed to be war. It made them hesitate, uncertain. The Americans returned, this time not with crates, but with gestures. One soldier stood at the doorway and beckoned with his hand, motioning for the women to step outside. They froze. The open air was as terrifying as the walls. Outside meant exposure. Outside meant more boots, more bayonets. Several shook their heads violently, whispering that it was a trap. The soldiers didn't push. They waited, patient, standing aside so the path remained clear. The red-haired GI raised his harmonica again, letting a gentle tune spill into the morning air. The melody floated beyond the doorway, inviting rather than commanding. One of the older women, her hands thin and scarred, rose slowly. She shuffled forward, her steps heavy as if dragging chains that no longer existed. She stopped at the threshold, looking back at the others. Her face trembled with fear, but also with something like defiance. She stepped outside. The sunlight struck her face, and for the first time in years she stood beneath the sky, not as a captive in shadows, but as a woman in the open. The others gasped. The soldiers made no move toward her, no hands reaching, no commands. They simply let her stand in the light. After a long silence, another woman followed, then another. Soon the group emerged slowly into the clearing, blinking against the brightness. The world looked unreal, trees swaying, birds calling, the sky vast and limitless after years of bamboo walls. The soldiers handed out more tins of food and packets of crackers, but this time, instead of leaving them inside, they laid them out beneath the sun. The women hesitated, then sat cautiously in the grass. One soldier crouched down and poured water into a basin, gesturing for them to wash. Soap was offered again, not demanded. The women touched the cool water, the lather, and for some, it was the first time in years they felt clean. The Korean girl dipped her hands into the basin, then splashed water on her face. She froze, expecting punishment for breaking a rule that no longer existed. But the soldiers only smiled. The fear loosened another notch. It was not yet freedom. The barbed wire still loomed in the distance, and their past still clung like shadows. But in the warmth of the morning sun, for the first time in years, the women began to remember what it felt like to be human. The women sat in the grass, thin bodies curled around tins of peaches and crackers. They ate cautiously, glancing up between bites, half expecting the food to be taken away. But the Americans only watched quietly, speaking in low voices. The red-haired GI, the one with the harmonica, tried again to bridge the silence. He picked up a stick and began tracing shapes in the dirt, clumsy outlines of a bird, a house, even a crooked sun. At first the women stared, confused. Then one of them, emboldened by the sight, reached for her own stick. She scratched characters into the soil, kanji letters spelling home. The soldiers couldn't read it, but they nodded solemnly, as if they understood. That was the beginning of their new language. No shared words, only gestures, sketches, and tone. A soldier mimed drinking and offered a cup. A woman mimed laughter with her hands over her mouth. Slowly, the silence filled with meaning. The Americans, realizing the women trusted objects more than voices, began leaving gifts. A bar of soap placed gently on a rock, a piece of cloth folded neatly on the ground. These offerings carried no demand, only patience. One soldier carved another bird, this time more carefully, and left it near the Korean girl. When she picked it up, her lips trembled. She did not smile fully, but she no longer clutched it as if it might be stolen. The women, in turn, began to offer small gestures back. A few swept the clearing with palm leaves, tidying the ground where the soldiers sat. Another refilled the soldiers' canteens at the well. Tiny acts, but heavy with unspoken words. We see your kindness. The soldiers respected those moments, never pushing for more. One WWII, remembering the warnings he had been given about trauma, wrote in his journal, "These women do not need promises. They need space to breathe again." At night, the women lay on thin mats provided by the medics. For the first time, they slept without fear of the door sliding open to boots and fists. The quiet was unnerving, but slowly it began to feel like safety. The harmonica returned each evening, soft notes drifting into the dusk. It was not perfect music, but it was different. Gentle, steady, unthreatening. For the women, it became a signal. Night would pass without violence. Trust did not bloom overnight. They still flinched when rifles clattered, still whispered among themselves in doubt. But each day brought another layer of proof. Soldiers who shared food instead of taking it, who spoke with laughter instead of commands. One woman later recalled, "We did not know the word for kindness in their language, and they did not know ours. But we both knew how to give and how to accept." That was enough. By then, the camp had shifted. It was no longer a cage of shadows, but a fragile bridge, where mercy was slowly rewriting what uniforms meant. It began with a stack of paper and a handful of pencils. The American officers placed them carefully on a table inside the hut, gesturing for the women to come forward. At first, no one moved. Paper had always meant ledgers, signatures, forced confessions. But then a medic bent down, scribbled his own name, and slid the pencil forward. The women stared at the word, meaningless to them but harmless. Slowly, one of the older women reached for the pencil. Her hand shook as she pressed the lead against the page. She hesitated, then scrawled the first word she had written in years, her name. It was crooked, uneven, but hers. She clutched the page to her chest as though reclaiming a part of herself. Soon others followed. Some wrote short notes, fragments of memory, prayers for mothers and sisters. Others wrote full letters, hesitant but desperate, describing food, clean water, and doctors who did not strike them. The Americans promised the letters would be sent home. The women didn't believe it at first. They had been taught that nothing passed freely between nations. Yet the mere act of writing felt like an act of rebellion against silence. One young nurse wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They give us food. They do not hurt us. I do not understand." Her words, shaky and simple, would one day cross oceans, startling families who had assumed their daughters were long dead. The act of writing opened something new inside the camp. The women began to whisper more freely, remembering words they had buried in fear. They laughed softly at mistakes, borrowed pencils, compared letters. One soldier, curious, picked up a sheet filled with kanji. He could not read it, but he pointed at the characters, then at her heart, as if to ask, "This is you?" She nodded, and for the first time her smile lingered. Not every woman could write. For those who could not, the soldiers offered to draw. A GI sketched a crude picture of a house with smoke curling from its chimney. A woman pointed to it and whispered, "Home." These letters, fragile as they were, became more than ink on paper. They were proof that their voices still existed, that they had not been erased by war. At night, the women folded the pages carefully, tucking them beneath their mats for safekeeping, until the officers collected them. Each one was a lifeline, a bridge back to families who had mourned them as ghosts. For the Americans, it was a routine gesture of protocol. For the women, it was nothing less than resurrection, the return of identity through words. One survivor would later say, "When I wrote my mother's name, I remembered I was her daughter again. Not a number, not a prisoner, a daughter." By now, days in the camp had taken on a rhythm. Meals at dawn, medical visits in the afternoon, quiet evenings filled with music or writing. On the surface, it resembled peace, yet beneath it, unease lingered. The women wrestled with a strange new weight. Kindness, once absent from their world, was now given freely. But receiving it felt almost unbearable. They had been told surrender erased honor. To accept mercy felt like betrayal of everything they had been taught. At night, some cried quietly into their blankets, not from pain, but from confusion. How could soldiers who wore the uniforms of enemies be gentler than those who had sworn to protect them? The contradiction gnawed at them. One woman whispered to her companion, "If they are kind, then who were the monsters?" The question carried no answer, only silence. The Americans, too, carried burdens. Many of the soldiers had sisters, wives, or daughters back home. To see women their own age, emaciated, scarred, and broken by years of captivity, stirred emotions they struggled to voice. Some wrote in diaries, calling the women ghosts walking or shadows of girls. Others confessed guilt that their rations were full while these captives had lived on scraps. Acts of compassion grew from this guilt. A soldier gave away his blanket, sleeping cold for a night. Another secretly saved sugar cubes from his coffee and left them at the women's door. These were quiet offerings, almost apologies. But for the women, kindness itself could feel like cruelty. It forced them to confront what had been stolen from them. Years of laughter, dignity, choice. Mercy illuminated their losses more sharply than pain ever had. One night, when the harmonica drifted through the camp again, a young woman covered her ears and wept. She explained later that beauty hurt too much. It reminded her of a world she might never return to. Still, the burden of kindness was not only pain, it also opened possibilities. The women began to imagine a life beyond the barbed wire, a future where gentleness was not a trick, but a truth. They spoke quietly about the lives they once dreamed of, teaching, nursing, even singing. For the first time in years, dreams returned, though fragile as glass. The Americans did not realize it, but every small gesture, every bandage, every tin of peaches, was rewriting the women's understanding of survival. Yet this fragile healing came with its own torment. For when kindness is discovered after cruelty, it is never simple. It is a reminder of what should have always been, and of how much had been lost before it arrived. The days after liberation blurred together. The women were no longer prisoners of the Japanese, yet they did not feel entirely free. The barbed wire still stood. The guards still carried rifles. But the atmosphere had shifted from domination to protection. For the first time, the women were allowed to walk outside without fear of being summoned. They stepped into the sunlight cautiously, their bare feet pressing into the dirt, as if expecting it to vanish beneath them. An American chaplain arrived one morning, speaking gently through an interpreter. He told them they would be taken to hospitals, then eventually sent home. The word home struck them harder than any rifle butt. For some, it no longer existed. Villages had been burned, families scattered, nations reshaped. Yet the promise itself was a bomb. To think of life after this, after huts, after soldiers, after silence, was dizzying. The younger women clung to one another like sisters. Some dared to laugh softly when soldiers showed them how to peel an orange, the juice running down their chins. Others wept openly when they were given soap and clean dresses, reminders of lives that felt distant but not gone. For the Americans, too, these moments lingered. Many would later write home about the sight of broken girls who smiled despite everything. They did not speak of it proudly, but with a kind of shame, an awareness that what they had saved these women from should never have existed in the first place. When the trucks finally arrived to take them away, the women climbed aboard with mixed hearts, relief, fear, disbelief. Some held their bundles of supplies as though they were lifelines. Others turned to look back at the huts, not with longing, but with a strange numbness. As the convoy rumbled toward the horizon, one soldier lifted his hand in farewell. To his surprise, several of the women, hesitant at first, lifted theirs in return. The gesture was small, awkward, but it carried the weight of survival, of recognition, of something human shared across the gulf of a war. Historians would later debate the numbers, the policies, the statistics of comfort women. But the truth lived not in ledgers, but in moments like this, when women who had been stripped of humanity found it returned in fragments. The road ahead would not be easy. Many survivors would face silence, shame, or disbelief when they told their stories. Some would never tell them at all. Yet the memory of that day, the soap, the peaches, the music, the hand raised in farewell, remained proof that cruelty had not erased all possibility of mercy. For the women, survival was no triumph, but it was not defeat either. It was something in between, a fragile redemption, carried in their bodies and their memories. Fragile, but unbroken. The war had stolen years, but it had not taken everything. The simple truth revealed in those final days was this: even after unthinkable cruelty, kindness could still exist. And for those who had endured the worst, that realization was nothing less than shocking. As the trucks rolled on, the women clutched their small treasures, soap, food, blankets, not as gifts from soldiers, but as tokens of a world that might one day be gentler. And in that fragile hope, amid the ruins of empire and the ashes of war, a new beginning trembled quietly into existence.